I think there was a real gap between, I guess, the capitalistic push within the economy at the time, and still is there today, with entrepreneurs on the fringes who are working at the village level and trying to make an impact.
Welcome to the ReThinkDesi Reframe series, where we challenge conventional narratives about social change, sustainability, and the South Asian community. Join me, your host, Arpita Sharma, each week as I have candid conversations with thought leaders, social entrepreneurs, researchers, activists, and creatives as we uncover the strategies, innovations, and stories behind their efforts to reshape our society. My name is Arpita Sharma, and today we're joined by Joseph Kalupodi, Creative Director of Solve Squad, a youth-centric social enterprise focusing on providing opportunities for those from refugee and migrant backgrounds. He also works as a cultural lead for SU Australia, a national nonprofit, as part of their Cultural Innovations and First Nations team. Additionally, he serves on the board of the Australian Refugee and Migrant Care Services, ARMCare, assisting those with disabilities from diverse cultural backgrounds. During this episode, he shares his journey as a South Asian immigrant and how it fuels his mission to support refugees. Joseph discusses infusing cultural heritage into creative work, fostering social equity within Solve Squad, and offering advice for aspiring changemakers, especially in the context of supporting refugees settling in the United States. Join us as we explore the transformative power of creativity and social entrepreneurship in building inclusive communities. So, welcome. It's very nice to have you here with us today.
Thanks, Arpita. Thanks for having me.
Can you share a little bit about your background and some of the challenges and triumphs you faced as a South Asian immigrant? Currently, you are in Australia, so I'd love to hear a little bit about that as well, and how this journey has influenced you on your perspective on social equity and the work that you're doing today as creative director of Solve Squad.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot to unpack there, but I'll start at the beginning. So I was born and raised in a typical, I guess, South Indian family. Both my parents were born in India. So I'm a first generation South Asian kid. But I think growing up, there was a lot of, I guess, focus on education, and rightfully so. Both my parents had done higher education, both in India and also in Australia. And I think for them, they placed that priority on me and my siblings as well. So my father had a business background. He had done his MBA here in Australia at a local university. So as most typical South Asian parents sort of pushed me in that direction. So yeah, I got my undergrad in business management. And I think around that time I was thinking about, well, how can I use sort of my business background for more of a, I guess, investment into community? Because at that time we were seeing a big influx in terms of the growth of the South Asian diaspora, especially in Australia. This was around the 90s. So yeah, growing up, I kind of started to notice that trend. And there was a lot of changes that were happening in terms of the Australian government opening up its borders, welcoming new migrants to Australia. And there's a lot of opportunities, I guess, that my parents were exploring at the time. So after I had graduated from my business degree, my parents set their sights on the States and said, it'd be great if you could sort of explore that as a way to further your education. So I totally switched in terms of my business background. I actually went into international development. So that was my major when I was studying in California. And I think totally, I guess, different in terms of changes, because it was my first time studying or living overseas. I was 21 years old at the time. So I was just kind of embracing all the changes, but at the same time, always looking forward to seeing how could I connect my business background to international development. So yeah, fast forward a few years, I worked for a little bit in the States in my field in international development. We were basically looking at what was called the Next Move project at the time with the US Center for World Mission. They were basically doing some research into how diaspora communities were connecting with their own cultural backgrounds in different countries. And so my focus was obviously in California with the South Asian diaspora. But that actually led me back to come back to Australia in 2015. So I was in the States for 2 years. And then when I finally came back, I realized there was a lot of, I guess, interest in people trying to work within that field of international development, but overseas. So I ended up going again overseas, but actually back to India to rediscover my cultural roots. And yeah, that's what really took me more into, I guess, the work on the ground in community transformation and social change, which is the field I'm in right now.
When you were in California doing work, what were some of your learnings? And then also in going to India as well, I'd love to hear about some of the projects and the works that you did do.
So I think in India, again, it was very different from growing up in Australia in terms of, I've noticed in most countries I've lived in, there's a slight difference within the diaspora of how things work. And obviously in India, being the motherland, there's so many things happening at the same time. It's sometimes a whirlwind of activity and it's hard to get your feet set. But at the time, I think it was a few years removed from the pandemic. So there was a lot of things happening in terms of foreign investment. And in regards to international development, there was a lot of, I guess, micro enterprises that were starting to crop up in different places all over India. So my, I guess, main focus was to visit different places across the country and find entrepreneurs, especially small business enterprises, where we could give them micro grants and basically walk alongside them, the founders or the entrepreneurs in their journey, give them the support and training and resources they need, and basically check in over a 2 or 3 year period to see how they were growing the business and how much impact they were having at the community level. And then based on that, sort of increase or extend the funding. So it was really great opportunity really to sit down with the founders one-on-one, hear their stories, identify, I guess, areas of need, and kind of strategically measure the impact over time. So it's very rewarding. Got to hear and connect with so many different people of different backgrounds, different, I guess, socioeconomic status, and how they had kind of, come up with innovative ways to help their community. So that really resonated with me over the time I was in India. And then when I finally came back to Australia around 2018, I was starting to think about how I could apply some of those learnings from overseas to my current context. And I think the connecting point between India and the current work I do now really resonates or lies with the work with youth empowerment, because a lot of the founders that we were connecting with were quite young. I would say between the 20s to early 20s to late 20s. So in terms of, I guess, their interest in economic empowerment and development, they were kind of on the outside looking in, I would say. They noticed a lot of the challenges that young people were facing in regards to building their own business, scaling it, finding support, finding resources, other fellow founders that could help them and encourage them on the journey. I think there was a real gap between, I guess, the capitalistic push within the economy at the time, and still is there today, with entrepreneurs on the fringes who are working at the village level and trying to make an impact. So I really started to notice that gap. And then when I finally came to Australia, I realized there was a similar gap, but working with refugees and migrants particularly, where they were almost 1 or 2 or 3 years removed behind the opportunities that most people their age were facing or experiencing, whether it was for their own, I guess, experiences living overseas, going through a lot of different challenges, especially with refugees that I worked with. A lot of them had their own trauma and, being removed from their families. So even trying to get to a position where they had the capacity to even do something creative or something full-time was very difficult. And then I guess with the South Asian community, the Desi community in Australia, by the time I came back, a lot of my peers were getting into the workforce, but were also finding things like racism being potential barriers to their advancement in their careers, things like obviously cultural barriers as well, and also familial and social pressure. So I think a combination of those factors I was starting to notice and pick up on. So I was really trying to hone in on how can we create a safe space for both refugees and migrants where they can not abandon their cultural, I guess, experiences or understanding, but use that as a tool to sort of springboard their own pursuits, whether that's in business or entrepreneurship or whatever the case was at the time. So that really kind of landed me into the work that I was focusing on.
Yeah, well, I'd love to first of all hear a little bit more about kind of your position at Solve Squad and how you're approaching it in this more kind of thoughtful and engaged way. And I think this conversation is really relevant because particularly in the U.S. right now, we are having an influx of migrants who are coming into this country, and there are constant struggles around conversations of whether these folks are going to be a tax on our economy, they're going to take our resources, they won't contribute, with and not necessarily recognizing the entrepreneurial potential for a lot of these migrants. Not that they need to be entrepreneurial in order for us to recognize their humanity, but recognizing that there are a lot of folks who are coming and need that support to be able to support themselves. So I'd love to hear kind of your work and how you're approaching it, and also from that cultural level of understanding, having been both in India and also explored like the U.S. And the Indian population here, South Asian population.
Yeah. Definitely, yeah. I think the transition back when I was just transitioning back from India to Australia, and even before that, transitioning back from America to my home country, I think the main, I guess, thing that I carried with me was the potential of people. And what I mean by that is, I mean, everyone has potential, but I think with especially young people, they have so much untapped resources and their own unique skills, like we were discussing before, that they don't really have anyone to give them that push until they find it in themselves to do it. So especially with the South Asian community in the States, I noticed they were so they were so able to put their ideas into practice because they had that community supporting them, especially in places like Silicon Valley. And that I found that there was such an ecosystem of entrepreneurship that they were encouraged to try anything, regardless of whether they would fail. And even if they did fail, that was used as a learning lesson to launch them into other pursuits. So I really appreciated that in terms of that culture of innovation that I noticed in the States. Of course, in India it's quite different because the population is so rapidly increasing that some people get left behind just because of the way things work in the system. And then when you add things like corruption and obviously, violence towards people of gender, based on their gender or social class, it adds more, I guess, barriers or hurdles to jump through. But one of the statistics when I was doing my work in India, which I came across, I was attending a youth conference at the time. And one of the people who was talking about sort of these changes in population and opportunities amongst young people, he had said, quite interesting stat, that over 50% of India's population is under the age of 25. And for me, I'd never heard that statistic before. And it kind of struck a chord with me to the point where I was like, well, if the majority of the population are young people, how come they don't have the opportunities to advance? And it didn't really make sense to me that we are the majority, but we don't have the platforms to do the things that we want to do, especially for the improvement of our own generation. So that kind of stuck with me. And as I mentioned, when I transitioned back to Australia and saw some of the similar issues amongst our South Asian community and also the refugee community, I knew I had to there had to be a different way to encourage people to move forward. And the best thing that I could come up with at the time was to identify movements that were already happening amongst young people and see what was my part to play in encouraging young people to obviously step forward in their pursuits. So at that time, I joined what was called the Global Shaper community. So it was started by the World Economic Forum several years ago. So basically operating as a sort of a young professional hub in different cities around the world, I joined my Brisbane Global Shaper Hub, Brisbane being my hometown here in Australia. And yeah, there was just so many different people from different cultural backgrounds doing different things, but were part of this sort of united movement to encourage people to put into practice, I guess, more things related to social cohesion and community development and social change. So as part of our, I guess our mandate with our professional hub, we had to basically launch a unique project every year for the betterment of our local community, and identifying that in consort with local stakeholders. So at the time that I joined, they had just launched what was known as ArmCare, which was the Australian Refugee and Migrant Care Services, and it was being spun off into its own non-profit organization. And the board at the time asked me to join and basically give strategic direction to how we could scale it to a national movement. Um, and me being quite young at the time, I had some very crazy ideas, but it was great to have other people around me who encouraged me and said, "Well, that's not so crazy, why don't we try that?" So we joined what was called the NDIS, which is the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which was just put in place by the government a few years prior to me joining, where basically we had the resources and funding from the government to specifically compensate people from refugee and cultural migrant backgrounds who had disabilities, but who wanted to, I guess, advance in their own independent living within their communities. So instead of taking people outside of their community and giving them, I guess, a totally different circumstance or way to live, we went to them within their own cultural community. We used local people who spoke their language to basically give them the resources and support they need, and then basically develop a plan to help them down their path in terms of what they wanted to do within their own family and also their own local community as well. So that model worked really well for a number of years, and then basically from there we started what is now called Solve Squad. So around the time where we launched Solve Squad, the pandemic had just happened. So this was 2020. And a lot of people, obviously, because of various reasons, were going online. So we thought, why don't we create a platform for refugees and migrants with the learnings that we had already started to keep track of during our work with ArmCare, and basically create this sort of online ecosystem where people can get some experience, especially coming out of college and university, and get the experience that they need to go into the workforce. Because one of the biggest, I guess, barriers that we noticed with working with refugee and migrant communities is a lot of the young folk who were studying at the time or trying to get into the workforce, they were getting pushed back because they didn't have enough local experience, working within either corporate or organizational, I guess, initiative. And then the other thing was a lot of them were getting pushed back because they were overqualified, because a lot of them wanted to go into the master's, PhD sort of route. And then when they were going to apply for jobs, they had higher degrees than their counterparts. And a lot of the gap was because they didn't have any local experience. So we focused on education as a starting point. And basically, we're telling a lot of our young people, why don't you sign up on our platform? We'll connect you to a mentor within your chosen area of interest, whether, that's IT or business or education. And then you go through a process of what we call virtual volunteering. So you allocate a few hours a week where you can work with your mentor, work with the organization we pair you up with, get a decent amount of experience over a 3 to 6 month period. And then basically we give you a recommendation and then set you up with a bunch of partner organizations we were working with at the time to get them at least a foot in the door to get some experience. So we started the platform and then basically worked with a bunch of people that we knew within our local community, and then kind of word spread and then it took off. So around, I would say, a year in, we developed it as a social enterprise. And then we started to get a lot more refugee and migrant-led businesses that started to support us financially. And then eventually we partnered with the United Nations Children and Youth Initiative. And we developed a number of resources online to do with like digital mentoring, training and employment online. We still continued with our virtual volunteering, and then we gave people, I guess, opportunities to enter into like online competitions, paid work experience, and things of that nature. And then by that time, it sort of snowballed. We started to notice similar, I guess, opportunities overseas, especially with our connections within the States. So we started partnering with a bunch of youth by youth initiatives in the States, and then the UK, Europe, Africa. And then most recently, we partnered with Microsoft as part of their global mentorship initiative, where I think right now we're sitting on about a 70 to 80% success rate, where people who go through our partner program, our global mentorship initiative, 80% of them end up getting paid employment, whether that's full-time or part-time. So yeah, we're really happy about where we're at right now, but always looking for new opportunities to expand and sort of continue the work we're doing.
I really wanted to delve a little bit into how your diverse educational background is both in business management, HRM, and theology, how the intersection of these disciplines has influenced your approach as creative director of Solve Squad, and in particular in fostering creativity and understanding diverse perspectives within your team.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in terms of the connecting point between my business background and then eventually when I got into international development and studying theology, a lot of people don't see the connection. But when I was studying international development overseas, the connecting point was really a concept that I stumbled across when I was doing my master's, which is called business as mission. So it's basically using business as a platform to launch more intentional initiatives to help people within, I guess, the marketplace. So we started to notice this when I was working in India. There was a company that I joined called Olive Technology. And one of the initiatives that we were doing was working with local business strategists to develop a platform online where we can connect with a wider audience. So a lot of the tech professionals in India, English is actually one of the most spoken languages, even though, there's several languages spoken in India. But English being the lingua franca of the business world, it was easier to get resources developed online in English and then get people to, basically learn using some of the online courses that we were developing. So when we would go to the villages and things like that, we noticed obviously the connection with technology was limited. But when we would start to explain, this is what you can use technology for, there are apps online where you can obviously learn different languages, you can become more familiar with technology, you can use it to communicate with people in different countries, let alone your own community. There are certain advantages that come with using, things like the internet. Even though a lot of people didn't have their own computers or laptops, and it was the first time, seeing it when we would pull it out. Like, I remember speaking to a number of villagers one time, and one of the first questions they asked me was, well, can you teach the villagers here how to use email? And I was like, okay, well, how do I explain it to people who have never used a computer before? So we had a whiteboard and I was drawing how you would open a browser. And I asked people, well, let's just put aside the internet for a second. Has anyone used a computer? And only 3 people in the room put their hand up. So for me, I had to kind of pare back everything that I had learned, my master's level, and basically simplify it. But one of the lessons that I learned there is not everyone is on the same page when it comes to education. And even when in overseas countries, when you're working with refugee and migrant communities, you really have to simplify things because not everyone has the same level of understanding. And even if they are, very curious to learn, you have to sort of start with square one. So when I applied this to working with communities who are younger, I started to notice, yes, there is a shared interest in terms of entrepreneurship, but how do we connect people's interest to a viable way to, scale how they would start, for example, their own social enterprise or their own non-profit initiative? And so I started basically with how do you really hone in on your area of interest How do you connect it to a current need that you see? Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, one of the biggest takeaways that I found, working with people from the village in India was their curiosity to learn new things. And especially when it came to technology and working, within communities with younger people, I think that the interest in learning new things is definitely there, but the gap comes when, they don't have the opportunities to obviously advance in their field of education. So I noticed a similar gap when I came back to Australia. So when I was working with refugees and migrants, especially within their own communities, there were significant barriers when it came to things like language or cultural backgrounds, taboos. There are certain topics we couldn't talk about, and there are certain topics that we can. But starting at square one was basically what is their area of interest and how can we connect it to a need that they're trying to address within their own community, and basically creating an opportunity for other young people to obviously join them in their pursuit. So for me, that was basically the starting point. And then within my work with Solve Squad, we noticed that we had to create a team which reflected the communities that we were trying to reach. That was very intentional and very important for us. So I specifically started hiring people from refugee and migrant backgrounds who had the skills or area of interest to basically connect with their own community and then bring business and opportunities in. So we started with a couple of people, and then the team grew, and then we started to work with people online. So, people were able to join us remotely for periods of time, and then we could give them opportunities to learn. And that model seemed to work really well. So within our local team, we had a South Sudanese refugee, we had an international student from Hong Kong, myself, and then we had a guy from Croatia and also a local Aussie, but he had a family who was originally from South Asia as well. So it's quite a diverse team, but we seem to work really well given our different unique strengths, and that really worked well for the purposes of Solve Squad. And we've had people come and go, but almost everyone who's worked with us, whether as a volunteer or as an employee, has gone on to work with one of our partners or people that we know within the community who have a team that's quite diverse as well. Usually people who go on to work with us sometimes start their own initiatives. We'll also work with, I guess, companies who have founders who are also from refugee and migrant backgrounds. So it really works well for what we're doing. And although we're quite small in terms of the social enterprise scene, we found that work actually works to our advantage because people are curious about how we started with a small team but kind of grew over time.
This is a really interesting approach, and in terms of kind of hiring and getting folks to be able to work within their own communities. I also I really would love to know is in terms of cross-cultural collaboration. When working in this space, what was that experience like, and what were there any lessons that you've taken away from that experience?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think for me, I'm always learning. I always tell people I'm always interested and curious in learning, especially when it comes to things related to community development. I think because communities are transforming so rapidly, it's often hard to kind of keep your finger on the pulse of what's changing. But that's why I've always focused on young people, because they're always on the cutting edge of, what are things that are affecting me personally on an individual level, but also on a community level, and then sort of taking that and applying it to the things that they're doing creatively. So, yeah, I think that's the biggest thing that I've held close to my heart. And then when it comes to, investing in the current generation, I think a lot of people, especially in the corporate world, we often talk about, investing into the leaders of tomorrow. But young people are, the leaders of today. We're at a point where a lot of people within the community, especially the South Asian community, where they're starting to develop platforms for people who can become leaders right now. And a lot of the leaders themselves are quite young. So I think surrounding yourself with people who can encourage you, who are also thinking creatively outside of the box, but also people who challenge you to think differently is also important, because when you get into a community where everyone's doing something unique, sometimes, the disadvantage is falling into groupthink, where we try and do things because people are telling us to do it, instead of, trying to pursue something that's quite unique. So I've always tried to encourage myself and others around me, look to do something different. Always try and pick up skills from people who are operating in a different, sector to you, or different industry, and try and apply it to what you're doing right now, because you never know, tomorrow what's going to happen, what's going to change. And we always need to, be ready for that next change as well. So, kind of within the area I'm working right now, working with a bunch of young people who are always encouraging me to think differently. That's helped to kind of, push me in the right direction. And also, I think establishing connections with people who have been in the industry for quite some time. I think the misconception is that, people who have been in a certain industry are resistant to change. But a lot of the entrepreneurs that I've talked to, especially those from cultural backgrounds, they're happy to catch up with you and talk about the latest ideas, because they're always trying to innovate as well. And they're quite open. For most of the organizations that we partner with at Solve Squad, I would say around 90% of them we've entered into partnership agreements with, because of the simple fact that they want to try something different, where young people are leading that change. And they often ask us, why don't you lead this initiative, and we'll sort of support you in that, and whatever sort of resources or training or people that you need to make your idea happen. We're just going to be behind you, pushing that 100%. So that's been really helpful to have, people behind us, especially mentors in the industry, like I mentioned, people from Microsoft, pushing our global mentorship initiative. And we recently started to work with, local government, who are now seeing the need for working with multicultural communities, getting the word out that there are grants and other resources to help fund new ideas in the industry. And just getting people to be aware of those opportunities, because most of the time they're just not aware. And once we tell them about it, they're our mouthpiece in the community to tell others. So we really try and push, getting the word out as much as possible, and introducing young people to those new ideas as well.
Yeah, that's really wonderful to hear, because I think one of the biggest struggles, and I think even getting coming outside of the migrant and refugee space in general, even for any entrepreneur, being able to identify and access opportunities can often be part of the biggest barriers to their success. And so being able to create environments where information about those opportunities is being more actively shared, I think is very powerful, and can create space to be able to help foster some of that innovation that's really needed. So what initiatives or strategies have you implemented at Solve Squad to ensure a diverse and inclusive work environment that reflects the richness of the varied cultural perspectives? And you've kind of delved a little bit into this already, in talking about how you've been very strategic in terms of hiring folks who are from the community to then work with that community, and then finding kind of opportunities for engagement that way. Are there any other kind of things that you would like to share in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're at a stage now where we're, about 3 years in to developing Solve Squad as a social enterprise. And sort of the transition that we've found ourselves in is more and more young people obviously want to get involved with what we're doing. But also there's such an untapped community of people who would like to get involved, but for whatever reason, they're at a point where they have to support, their own families, or they have other work pressures. They work their own, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday job, but do have, time to volunteer, or there are certain opportunities where we want to get people involved. So we've developed sort of like a collaborative network where people can basically reach out to us and say, hey, I would like to get involved in an upcoming campaign or initiative you have. but I just don't have the time. Can you let me know in advance? So we've developed what we call a spotlight series. So every Friday we kind of highlight an opportunity or organization that we're working with that's led or run by young people within a specific community, and then we basically interview a founder or entrepreneur who's running that initiative and ask them sort of their startup stories. So, how they got into that work, why they're focusing on a specific community or cultural group, and what are sort of the latest things that they're working on or opportunities where people can get involved. And for us, that's really streamlined the way that we're able to connect with our network and also get the word out about new initiatives as well for people who want to get involved. So that's something that we're trying to be more intentional about. And obviously the group or network of organizations we always work with currently right now, we have about 30 different companies and nonprofits and also other social enterprises that we work with. So we always go back to them and say, hey, is there an event or gathering that you guys are working on right now where we can invite some of our young people and they can meet you, sort of network one-on-one. So we've started to do more hybrid events kind of coming out of COVID last year. So some of the things that we're doing right now is with one example that I can share off the top of my head is with a movement called Humans for Good. So it's basically a network of people who have creative ideas, but they want to do it collaboratively with other people. So we use, Slack and LinkedIn and other platforms to basically do like a blast every week of different opportunities that are out there, and people can basically put their hand up and say, hey, I want to take the lead on this, or hey, I know someone within my company or within my community that would be interested. And we basically use that sort of organic network to start, initiatives off the ground. And we found it to be very helpful. We've got like a number of opportunities that we're working on right now and very, I guess, grassroots based. So we've started to do like community potlucks where people sort of bring a dish to share from their own cultural community. And then basically we have people that we interview, entrepreneurs or founders that share their story from a cultural perspective. And then we have like a Q&A. So we're trying to do that every 2 months. To the point now we're doing it in different cities as well. And we get people within their local city to sort of host it. And then we would get local people to share their stories in those particular cities. So we've done that a few times. We're starting to roll that out this year as well. And then, continuing with our Spotlight series. So we're just starting to do sort of low level like conferences and also other smaller gatherings with other entrepreneurs as well. And then we do workshops from time to time online as well. So trying to make it as convenient for young people to get involved because we know that they're always, so busy with their own sort of initiatives or their own opportunities as well. But creating that space where they can still get involved and do something impactful and meaningful in their own time as well.
Yeah, thank you. I could actually hear you, so this was awesome. I wanted to just in listening to you, there were a couple of things that came up to me. First was, are those recorded and are they available? So if folks in the audience wanted to kind of listen to some of those stories, they might be able to access them. First, are they available?
Yes, yeah. So we try and record most of our annual gatherings. So we have like conferences we do every year. And then our workshops and things are also recorded. So we have a media page on our website, which I can also share with the listeners as well.
Yeah, I think that would be really wonderful. And then a second question that was coming up for me, and this is partially because of the experience that we've had with migration and refugees in the U.S. as well, is that often there are language barriers that can prevent people from really being able to understand and take in the information. And so do you have struggles such as that you deal with in the process of kind of bringing folks like this together? And are there ways that you've found to deal with it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when it comes to language and cultural barriers, we encourage people, especially when we're doing, bigger events with like the local government, where they have the resources and funding to do so. We say it's best to hire a young person who's familiar within the community, who people know and trust, who can serve as translators or can develop, things after an event has occurred to take it back to the community. Because again, there are certain barriers when it comes to, I guess, financial barriers. There's only so many scholarships that you can give for people to attend events, especially when they're in different locations. So we always try and get the resources out to the community even after we do an event. And yes, we do try and get people, especially young people, to serve as translators if the language is not English at the event itself, and also people to often translate, resources. And we do have, I guess, government initiatives that we partner with where they can translate those, and they have funding for that, where they can do it digitally. So yeah, we always try and push for that. And within our own team, if we have people who can obviously translate, then we try and do that. And we're always encouraging our young people sort of to take the stage and share their own stories if they're comfortable in their own language. We've been trying to push that a lot quite recently as well.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. Okay, so I would love for us to end on this question of, for aspiring South Asian changemakers or changemakers in general who are looking to make a positive impact on their communities, what advice would you offer based on your experience and successes in promoting social equity through your work at Solve Squad?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say the number one advice I say to young people is be curious, because I think, as I mentioned, things are always changing and there's so many opportunities out there. It's always good to kind of keep your ears and eyes open to some of the opportunities, whether it's at a local level or even global. I think there's ways where young people can get involved and sort of scale, their area of interest to a point where they can have the resources and support that they need to get their idea off the ground. And the second thing I would say to people is use your network. It's always good to find the people within your network, whether it's, on a local or even a strategic level, who are there to sort of rally around you and encourage you. Whether that's, being a mentor or finding people, in your circle who can encourage you to think more, I guess, creatively or outside of the box. Because there's so many people who are in positions of influence who can actually, provide like a sounding board for your ideas, or even give you, people that they can connect you with who can also help you within, the things that you're trying to do within a community level or otherwise. And even if you have like a creative idea where you'd really like to partner with someone, you'd be surprised with people who who are doing also, equally creative things. So trying to find those people where you can collaborate with and start something new or unique. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, but oftentimes just looking at something from a different perspective and coming up with a solution that works for the majority of people. I think those two things I would say: be curious and use your network.
And with that, thank you so much for joining us today, Joseph.
No, thanks for having me. Yeah, I really appreciate it.
And for folks in the audience, we'll link all of the various items that you talked about during the conversation in the show notes for you all. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.